The whispers started before he even found a seat. That's Harlan Voss. Poor old Harlan. Farms with equipment that belongs in a museum. Drives a truck held together by rust and stubbornness. What in the world is he doing here? It was Saturday morning, November 4th, 1989. Cold enough that breath fogged the air inside the auction barn before the heating units kicked in. The Keller Equipment Liquidation Auction in Waterloo, Iowa. The biggest farm equipment sale in state history. 32 John Deere tractors, all running, all maintained, lined up outside in the gray November light, like soldiers waiting for orders. Dealers had driven in from Des Moines, Minneapolis, and Kansas City. Bank representatives sat in the middle rows with briefcases and careful eyes. Farmers came from 5 counties, some arriving before dawn, parking their trucks in the gravel lot, and standing in the cold drinking coffee from thermoses, talking about prices and horsepower and which machines were worth chasing. This was the sale of the decade. Everyone in agricultural Iowa knew it. And there, slipping into the back row without a word to anyone, was Harlan Voss, 67 years old, 320 acres outside Nashua, Iowa. A man who had farmed the same land for over 3 decades without fanfare, without debt, and without anyone paying him much attention. He wore overalls that had been patched so many times the original fabric was impossible to identify. His boots had separated at the right toe, the leather peeling back like a tired smile. His flannel shirt was worn thin at both elbows. His cap, green, once had faded to a color that had no name. He sat down, folded his hands in his lap, and looked at the front of the room. A dealer from Des Moines leaned toward the man beside him. That truck out in the lot, the '71 Chevy with the cracked taillight and the rust eating through the wheel wells. That's Harlan's, wouldn't fetch $500 at auction. I don't know what he thinks he's doing here. The man beside him glanced toward the back row. Maybe he just wanted something to do on a Saturday. They laughed quietly and turned back toward the front. Harlan heard them. He always heard things people assumed he couldn't. He had learned that in Korea back when being underestimated was sometimes the only advantage a young man had. He said nothing. He unfolded a piece of notebook paper from his breast pocket, smoothed it against his knee, and studied it for a moment. Then he folded it again and put it back. Chet Morrow stepped up to the podium at exactly 9 in the morning. Chet was the best auctioneer in Iowa, maybe in the Midwest. 54 years old, built like a man who had spent his youth throwing hay bales, with a voice that could fill a barn without a microphone. He had run auctions for 30 years. He had seen fortunes made and broken at his podium. He called every auction with the same level calm, the same professional distance, the same practiced rhythm that turned numbers into music. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Keller liquidation. 32 John Deere tractors. We are going to start today by offering the entire lot as a single purchase. You take all 32 or you take none. Opening bid is $2.4 million. The room murmured. $2.4 million was steep but fair. The tractors ranged from 1973 to 1987. The newest machines were 4050s and 8060s in excellent condition. The oldest were 4020s with high hours but solid bones. Average price per unit roughly $75,000. For a dealer with capital and customers, it was a reasonable investment. Do I hear 2.4 million silence? 2.2 nothing. 2 million, even someone start us at 2 million. A hand went up near the middle. Chicago dealer, 2 million. Another hand, Minneapolis, 2.1. The bidding stalled at 2.1 and died there. Buying all 32 at once required too much capital, too much storage, too much risk. Chet let it breathe for 30 seconds, then made his decision. All right, folks, we'll move to individual sales. More opportunity for everyone. The room relaxed. Individual sales meant smaller bids, more participation, more excitement. The energy shifted from cautious to competitive. Chet started with the newest machine, a 1987 John Deere 4050 with 300 hours on the engine, practically new by farm standards. Opening at $90,000, hands flew up. The 4050 sold for $112,000 to a farmer from Charles City who pumped his fist quietly when the hammer came down. The second tractor, a 1985 8860, went for $142,000. The third, a 1984 4440, brought $98,000. The auction found its rhythm. Harlan sat in the back row and watched. He did not raise his hand. He did not lean forward. He did not study the machines the way the dealers did, calculating resale margins in their heads. He simply watched with the quiet attention of a man who had spent his life reading weather, reading soil, reading the slow and patient language of the land. His eyes moved around the room methodically. The dealers, the farmers, the bank representatives, the machines outside through the barn's open side doors sitting in the cold light. By noon, Chet had sold 18 tractors. Total sales had reached $1.9 million. 14 machines remained. Chet called a lunch break back at 1 o'clock for the final 14. The crowd moved toward the food trucks parked outside. The smell of hot coffee and fried food drifted through the barn doors. People gathered in clusters, talking prices, talking deals, talking about which of the remaining machines were worth pursuing and which were too old to bother with. Harlan walked to his truck. He sat in the cab engine off and ate a sandwich he had packed at home that morning. 2 slices of white bread, some sliced ham, yellow mustard. He drank coffee from a thermos. The cab smelled like old vinyl and motor oil, and the particular cold of a November morning that has decided it is not going to warm up no matter what the calendar says. 2 farmers walked past on their way to the food trucks. "Look at that rust bucket. I'm surprised it made it here from Nashua." The other one laughed. "Old Harlan probably can't afford a hot dog, much less a tractor." Their voices carried clearly through the cracked window. Harlan took a slow sip of coffee. He looked out through the windshield at the auction barn, at the farmers and dealers milling around in the cold, at the line of John Deere green visible through the open bay doors. He finished his sandwich. He finished his coffee. He checked his watch. At 5 minutes to 1, he got out of the truck and walked back inside. The afternoon session moved faster. Farmers who had been patient all morning now competed sharply for the remaining machines. Tractors 19 through 28 sold in rapid succession, averaging $78,000 apiece. The room was looser now, warmer, the early tension replaced by the satisfaction of transactions completed and deals made. By 3 in the afternoon, only 4 tractors remained. The oldest ones, the least desirable. Machines that had been passed over in the morning rush, sitting at the end of the lot like guests nobody had gotten around to inviting to dance. Tractor 29, a 1976 443. Opening bid $40,000. Sparse bidding, sold for $52,000. Tractor 30, a 1974 4030. Sold for $48,000. Tractor 31, a 1973 4020. Opening bid $35,000. 2 bidders only. Sold for $42,000. Final machine, number 32, a 1973 John Deere 4020. Same model as number 31. High hours. Paint faded and chalky. One hydraulic line had been replaced recently, and the patchwork was visible, competent but obvious. It was the oldest machine in the entire auction, the one dealers had glanced at and moved past the one farmers had assessed and quietly crossed off their lists. Opening bid $35,000. One hand went up. A local farmer in the 3rd row who had been outbid on 2 better machines and was now willing to settle. $35,000. Do I hear 36? The local farmer raised his paddle again. 36. Thank you. 37. Silence. 36.5. Nothing. The room had moved on mentally. People were putting on their coats, checking their phones, talking quietly to their neighbors. The auction was almost over. The last machine was going to sell cheap. Chet prepared to close, going once at $36,000. A hand went up in the back row. Chet paused. He looked toward the back of the barn, at the man in the patched overalls and the faded cap, at the man who had sat in that seat for 6 hours without raising his hand once. "Sir, your bidding." Harlan's voice was calm and clear. $40,000. The room went quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when something unexpected happens. Not silence exactly, but a held breath. Heads turned. The dealer from Des Moines looked over his shoulder. The bank representatives looked up from their paperwork. Chet Morrow looked at Harlan Voss with the practiced neutrality of a man who had learned never to show surprise at an auction. The local farmer in the 3rd row counted. 42. Harlan, 45. A murmur moved through the crowd. The local farmer looked at his wife beside him. She shook her head slightly. He put his paddle down. Chet looked at Harlan. Any other bids? Silence. Sold. $50,000 to the gentleman in the back row. Sir, your name for the record, Harlan Voss. Chet wrote it down. Congratulations, Mr. Voss. Please see the clerk for payment processing. The crowd buzzed the way crowds buzz when they have witnessed something they don't quite understand. Harlan Voss, who couldn't afford a hot dog, had just paid $50,000 for a tractor. Where did that come from? What was he going to do with it? That machine was 30 years old. His farm was 320 acres. He didn't need a second tractor that old. He didn't need one tractor that old. None of it made sense. Harlan rose from his seat, smoothed his overalls, and walked toward the payment table. Sylvia Pruitt had been working the payment desk since 7 that morning. 26 years old, organized and quick, she had processed 18 transactions before lunch and had developed an efficient rhythm. Paddle, number, bid amount, name, payment method, signature. 18 times without interruption. She looked up when Harlan approached. Mr. Voss, you've won lot 32 at $50,000. And how will you be paying today? Harlan reached into his front overall pocket and pulled out a checkbook. The cover was worn smooth, the edges soft from years of handling. Check acceptable. Absolutely. We accept checks from established accounts. Harlan opened the checkbook, uncapped a pen from his breast pocket, and wrote. His handwriting was careful and deliberate, the kind of penmanship taught in one-room schoolhouses in the 1930s, letters formed with attention and precision. He tore the check free and handed it to Sylvia. She looked at it. $50,000 exactly. First Federal Bank of Waterloo. Harlan D. Voss. She processed the payment, stamped his receipt, handed him his copy. You're all set, Mr. Voss. Tractor 32 is yours. You can arrange pickup any time through the end of the week. Harlan folded his receipt and put it in his pocket. He started toward the door. Then he paused. Sylvia looked up. He was standing with his back half toward her, looking at the barn doors and the gray afternoon light beyond them. Mr. Voss. He turned slightly. His face was weathered in the particular way of men who have worked outside for 40 years. The skin creased and tanned and honest, the kind of face that has nothing left to hide because it never tried to hide anything to begin with. Sylvia heard herself ask before she had decided to. If you don't mind me asking, why that one? It's the oldest machine here. You could have bid on the newer ones earlier. Harlan looked at her for a moment. His eyes were a pale, clear gray, steady in the way of men who have learned to be still. Reminds me of a machine an old man gave me back in '54. He said it quietly without drama, the way people say true things. Same model, same year of manufacture near enough. Just needed to have one again. He walked out into the November cold. Sylvia watched the barn doors swing shut behind him. She stood at the payment table with the receipt carbon in her hand and the faint smell of his coffee still in the air, and she thought about what he had said, the way he had said it, the particular weight of those words, the flatness of them, the way they carried something much larger than the words themselves contained. She was still thinking about it when she locked the office at 5:30 and drove home. That night, 23 miles east of Waterloo, in the small house he had built himself in, 1961, Harlan Voss backed his truck up to the barn and sat for a moment with the engine running and the heater blowing. The machine was already there. He had arranged for it to be delivered that afternoon, paying the transport fee without discussion. Now it sat in the barn in the yellow light of the single overhead bulb, its green paint chalky and faded, its metal cold, its presence filling the space in a way that had nothing to do with its size. Harlan killed the engine and got out. He walked into the barn slowly, the way he walked everywhere, without hurry, without wasted motion. He stood in front of the tractor and looked at it for a long time. He ran one hand along the engine hood, feeling the cold metal under his palm, the slight texture of old paint and decades of outdoor work. On the wall to his right, between a coil of rope and a spare belt hanging from a nail, was a photograph. Black and white, faded at the edges, tacked directly to the wood without a frame. A young man and an older man standing side by side in front of a Farmall H tractor. The young man was lean and straight, wearing an army haircut grown out 2 inches, looking at the camera with the expression of someone who is not sure yet whether life is something to trust. The older man was broad across the shoulders with a face full of deep lines, one hand resting on the tractor fender, squinting slightly against the sun. Harlan Voss at 23 years old. And Emmett Gale. The photograph had hung on that wall for 31 years. Harlan had never moved it, had never needed to. He looked at the photograph now the way he looked at it on certain evenings. Not with grief exactly, but with the particular weight of something unfinished. Emmett Gale had been 58 years old in that photograph, a second-generation Iowa farmer who had built his operation through the Depression and the war years and the long, uncertain decades that followed, who had never become rich but had never broken either, who had understood something about farming and about men that most people spent their whole lives missing. In the spring of 1954, Harlan had come back from Korea with $387 in military savings and no prospects whatsoever. He had grown up in Nashua, the son of a factory worker who had tried farming twice and failed twice, which had given Harlan both a love of the land and a clear-eyed understanding of how quickly it could break a man who wasn't careful. He had spent his army years in the mountains of Korea thinking about soil and seasons, about the kind of life that had roots instead of assignments, about the difference between belonging somewhere and simply being stationed there. He came back to Iowa with his $387 and knocked on Emmett Gale's door because Emmett was the only farmer he knew who might give a 23-year-old ex-soldier a chance to work. Emmett had given him more than that. He had given him work, yes, fair wages and a bunk in the equipment barn and meals at the family table. But in the spring of that year, when Harlan had saved nearly $800 and mentioned carefully cautiously that he was thinking about renting some acreage of his own, Emmett had walked out to the back of the barn and pointed at the Farmall H sitting in the corner. "That machine is yours to use, son. Take it with you. Pay me when you can." Harlan had stared at the tractor. Then at Emmett. "That's worth more than I have," he had said. Emmett had shrugged with the particular ease of a man who has thought about something for a long time and arrived at a conclusion he is comfortable with. "I know what it's worth. I know what you're worth, too. Take the machine." Harlan had started farming 80 acres that spring with a Farmall H and $800 in savings. He had paid cash rent, lived on almost nothing, and rebuilt his finances with the slow, determined patience of a man who had learned in Korea that survival is mostly a question of not giving up. He farmed with that machine for 6 years. It never broke down in any way he couldn't fix himself. It worked every field he asked it to work. On cold mornings when it was slow to start, it always started. By 1960, he had saved enough to put a down payment on his own land. He had driven to Emmett's farm with $800 in cash and an envelope, with the rest a total that finally matched what the Farmall H had been worth on the day Emmett handed him the keys. Emmett had looked at the money for a long time. Then he pushed it back across the kitchen table. "You already paid me," he said. Harlan had pushed it back toward him. They had sat at that table for nearly 20 minutes, not speaking, while the coffee went cold between them. Finally, Emmett had picked up the cash and put it in his shirt pocket, not because he wanted it, but because he understood that Harlan needed to give it. That some men carry the weight of a debt until they can set it down properly, and that refusing to let them set it down is its own kind of cruelty. 3 years after that afternoon at the kitchen table, Emmett Gale's wife had called Harlan on a Tuesday morning in March of 1979 to tell him that Emmett had died in his sleep. "Heart failure." "Peaceful," she said. He went easy. Harlan had sat down on the kitchen floor when she said it. Not dramatically. There was no one to see. He simply sat down because his legs stopped working for a moment and the floor seemed like the right place to be. He had gone to the funeral. He had stood at the grave in the March cold with 300 Iowa farmers who had known Emmett Gale in various capacities: as a neighbor, as a competitor, as a lender of equipment and advice, as the kind of man who represented something about the agricultural Midwest that was already beginning to disappear even then. Harlan had stood at the back and not spoken to anyone and driven home alone. He had arrived back at his farm with $8,000 in cash that he had intended to give Emmett. A gesture, a rounding up of the debt, something to say in the language of farmers who don't speak easily about gratitude, what Emmett had meant to him. He had sat with the money on his kitchen table for 3 days. On the 4th day, Emmett's son Doyle had come by. Doyle Gale was 45 years old in 1979, a quiet and capable farmer who had taken over his father's operation and run it steadily for a decade. He had the same broad shoulders as Emmett and the same squinting, sun-weathered face. He sat down at Harlan's kitchen table and accepted the cup of coffee. Harlan pushed the envelope across the table. Doyle looked at it, looked at Harlan. "For your father, it's what I owed him." Doyle didn't touch the envelope. He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. Dad didn't talk about money much, but he talked about you sometimes. Not what he gave you. He never talked about that. He talked about what you did with it. Said it made everything worth doing. Harlan didn't say anything. Doyle pushed the envelope back. Dad didn't want this. He wanted you to do for someone else what he did for you. He said that once, couple years ago. Said that's the only debt he ever cared about collecting. Harlan had held the envelope in both hands for a long time. He had put it in the drawer of his kitchen table when Doyle left, and he had left it there for 10 years, while he tried to figure out how to pay a debt that couldn't be paid in cash. How to honor a man who hadn't wanted money, who had wanted something harder and more lasting and more real. He had been waiting for the right moment. Now he stood in his barn on a November night in 1989, his hand resting on the cold hood of a 1973 John Deere 4020. That was the same age and model as the machine beside which he had stood as a 23-year-old soldier trying to figure out if he had a future. The single overhead bulb threw yellow light across the barn floor. Somewhere outside, the wind had picked up and was moving through the bare trees along the fence line with the low, persistent sound of a season that has made up its mind. Harlan looked at the photograph on the wall. He looked at it for a longer time. Then he went inside, sat at the kitchen table, and opened the drawer. The envelope was still there. He took out the piece of notebook paper he had carried in his breast pocket through the auction, the same piece he had smoothed on his knee in the back row, while dealers laughed about his truck in the front of the room. He unfolded it on the table under the kitchen light and looked at it carefully. 32 names, written in pencil in the same careful, deliberate handwriting he had used to write the check that afternoon. 32 young farmers, men he had watched and assessed over years quietly without their knowledge, the way Emmett Gale had once watched a 23-year-old ex-soldier and decided he was worth believing in. He had been building this list for a long time. He picked up his pen. At the top of the page above the first name, he wrote 2 words, "Pay forward." He capped the pen and set it down and looked at the list in the quiet of his kitchen while the wind moved through the trees outside and the old house settled around him, and Harlan Voss, the richest poor man in Iowa, began to plan the most important transaction of his life. Monday morning came cold and gray, the kind of November morning in Iowa that doesn't bother pretending to be anything other than what it is. The fields outside Waterloo were frozen hard, the last of the corn stubble standing stiff in the ground like something that had given up but hadn't fallen over yet. The sky was the color of old pewter, low and flat and absolute. Harlan Voss drove his 1971 Chevy into the Keller auction office parking lot at 8:45 in the morning. He parked in the same spot he had used on Saturday near the edge of the lot where the gravel gave way to frozen grass. He sat in the cab for a moment with the engine running, looking at the building. Then he turned the key, got out, and walked inside. Sylvia Pruitt was already at her desk. She had arrived at 8, as she always did, to file the Saturday paperwork and prepare the week's accounting. She was halfway through her second cup of coffee when the front door opened, and she looked up and saw Harlan Voss standing in the entrance, in his patched overalls, in his faded cap, holding a piece of folded notebook paper in one hand. She had thought about him on Sunday, had mentioned him to her husband at dinner, the old farmer who bought the oldest tractor for $50,000, and said it reminded him of a machine an old man gave him in '54. Her husband had said, "Sounds like a character." She had said, "I think there's more to it than that." Now he was standing in her office on a Monday morning, and she had the distinct feeling that she had been right. "Good morning, Mr. Voss. Can I help you with something?" Harlan walked to her desk and placed the notebook paper in front of her. He unfolded it carefully, smoothing it flat with the palm of his hand, the way he had smoothed it on his knee in the auction barn 2 days earlier. Sylvia looked down at the page. 31 numbers, written in pencil. Lot numbers 1 through 31. Every tractor from Saturday's auction except the one Harlan had purchased. "I want to buy these," Harlan said. Sylvia looked at the list, then at Harlan, then back at the list. "Mr. Voss, the auction is over. These tractors were all purchased on Saturday by various dealers. They're not Keller's property anymore. I know that. I want to buy them from the dealers." Sylvia set down her coffee. She kept her voice level and professional, the way she had been trained. "Sir, we're talking about 31 tractors. The dealers paid approximately $2.8 million for those machines combined. With markup, you're looking at over $3 million minimum. Probably closer to 3.4. Harlan nodded once. Can you contact them for me? Sylvia looked at him for a moment. Mr. Voss, I need to ask you directly. Are you serious about this? Because if you want me to start making calls on your behalf, I need to know that you actually have the means to follow through. Harlan reached into his front overall pocket. He pulled out a folded document, crisp and formal against the worn fabric of his clothing, and placed it on the desk beside the notebook paper. Sylvia looked at it. It was a bank statement. First Federal Bank of Waterloo. Account holder, Harlan D. Voss. She read the balance line once. Then she read it again slowly because her brain refused to process it on the first pass. $11,240,000. Her hands went still on the desk. She looked up at Harlan Voss, at the patched overalls, at the boots with the peeling toe, at the faded cap and the weathered face, and the pale gray eyes that were watching her with a patience that suddenly seemed like something much larger than patience. This is your account, she said. It came out quieter than she intended. Yes. Harlan picked up the bank statement, folded it carefully, and returned it to his pocket. Can you contact the dealers, he asked. Sylvia sat very still for 3 full seconds. Then she picked up the phone. She spent the rest of the morning making calls. 7 dealers had purchased tractors on Saturday. She reached all 7 by noon. She explained the situation carefully, professionally, without editorializing. A local farmer wanted to purchase all 31 tractors at a fair price above what the dealers had paid. Cash transaction. Full payment within 48 hours. 6 of the 7 dealers agreed without significant negotiation. The numbers worked. A guaranteed sale at an 18% markup with no carrying costs, no storage fees, no sales effort required. Clean and simple. The kind of deal that didn't need much thinking. The 7th dealer did not agree. Prescott Dahl. He was the largest dealer of the 7 out of Des Moines. He had purchased 8 tractors on Saturday, including 4 of the best machines in the auction, the 1985 and 1986 models, with low hours and strong resale value. He was 61 years old, a second-generation equipment dealer who had built his business into a regional operation with 4 locations and a reputation for knowing exactly what something was worth and extracting every dollar of it. When Sylvia explained the proposal, there was a long pause on the line. Who's the buyer, Harlan Voss? Farmer out of Nashua. Another pause longer this time. Harlan Voss, yes, sir. The pause that followed had a different quality. Not the pause of a man doing arithmetic. The pause of a man remembering something. I'm not interested, Dahl said. Mr. Dahl, the offer is above your purchase price by I heard you. I said, I'm not interested. Those tractors aren't for sale to Harlan Voss. The line went quiet. Sylvia wrote not interested next to Dahl's name in her notes and underlined it once. When Harlan returned to the office that afternoon, she told him the results. 6 dealers confirmed total purchase price for 23 tractors, approximately $2.4 million. 1 dealer declined. Prescott Dahl. 8 tractors firm refusal. Harlan listened without expression. Did he say why? He said the tractors weren't for sale to you specifically. He didn't explain further. Harlan was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded slowly the way a man nods when something confirms what he already half suspected. He didn't ask more questions. He didn't push Sylvia for information she didn't have. He simply looked at the window for a moment, at the gray November light coming through the glass, and then he looked back at her. Set up the purchase for the 23, he said. I'll find 8 more machines elsewhere. Sylvia looked at him. You'd rather find replacements than pursue Dahl. Harlan's expression didn't change. Some debts are worth chasing. Some aren't. Let's move forward with what we have. He left the office at 4 in the afternoon. Sylvia sat at her desk after he was gone and looked at her notepad at the numbers and names and the single underlined notation that said not interested. And she thought about the particular way Harlan had said, some debts are worth chasing, the economy of it, the weight of a man who had learned to spend his words carefully because he had learned that most things don't require as many words as people use. She thought about what it would take to accumulate $11 million farming 320 acres in Iowa. She decided she needed to understand who Harlan Voss actually was. It took her 2 days. She started with county property records and Farm Bureau filings. Then the local newspaper archive going back to the 1950s. Then a conversation with a retired agricultural loan officer at First Federal who had known Harlan since 1959 and spoke about him with the careful respect of a man describing something he had witnessed but still didn't entirely understand. By Wednesday evening, Sylvia had assembled the outline of a life that looked from the outside almost impossibly ordinary, and from the inside like one of the most disciplined financial achievements she had ever encountered. Harlan Voss had come back from Korea in the summer of 1953 at 23 years old with $387 in military savings. He had grown up in Nashua, the son of a factory worker, with no land, no equipment, and no inherited agricultural knowledge, beyond what any Iowa boy absorbs simply by existing in farming country. He had come home to a post-war economy that was reorganizing itself rapidly, and an agricultural landscape that was beginning to favor size and capital over patience and skill. He had none of the capital, he had all of the patience. He had worked as a hired hand for Emmett Gale through the fall of 1953 and into the spring of 1954, learning the specific grammar of that particular land, how it drained, how it held moisture, which fields went wet in a hard spring, and which ones could be planted early. When Emmett gave him the Farm All H and the freedom to rent 80 acres of his own, Harlan had applied everything he had learned with the methodical intensity of a man who understood that he would not get a second chance to get this right. He had rented 80 acres at $8 per acre annually. He had lived on $60 a month. He had fixed every piece of equipment himself, learning by necessity the mechanical language of machines that most farmers paid someone else to speak. He had planted, cultivated, harvested, and planted again with the steady, unspectacular rhythm of a man building something too slowly to be noticed, but too carefully to fail. By 1959, he had purchased 160 acres. He had paid cash for the down payment and cleared the bank loan in 8 years by living on less than $1,200 annually while farming income climbed to $18,000. He had not expanded beyond 320 acres. He had not hired permanent help. He had not bought new equipment when used equipment could be repaired. He had not built a new house when the old house could be maintained. He had saved. In 1966, he had opened an account with a municipal bond broker in Cedar Falls and invested $5,000 at 4.5% tax exempt. He had added to it annually, sometimes more, sometimes less, always something. By 1975, the bond portfolio was worth $120,000. He had also begun buying farmland during the agricultural crisis of 1983 to 1985, when over-leveraged farmers across Iowa were losing properties they had purchased at peak prices in the 1970s. Harlan had no debt. He had cash. He had moved carefully and without publicity, purchasing 4 distressed properties at depression prices and selling them again at recovery prices between 1985 and 1988. Profit on those transactions over $300,000. By November of 1989, Harlan Voss's financial position was this: 320 acres of owned farmland valued at $1.2 million, an investment portfolio of municipal bonds and dividend stocks valued at $8.4 million, cash on hand $1.6 million, total net worth $11.2 million, built over 45 years on 320 acres, by a man who lived on under $1,200 a year, who drove a 1971 Chevy with a cracked taillight, who ate sandwiches alone in the cab during the biggest farm auction in Iowa history while people laughed about his truck. Sylvia put down her notes on Wednesday night and sat at her kitchen table for a long time. She thought about the word discipline. She thought about what it actually required in practice in daily life over decades. Not the discipline of a single difficult decision, but the discipline of 10,000 small, ordinary decisions made the same way year after year, without applause, without recognition, without anyone watching or caring or even noticing. She thought about what it would feel like to be worth $11 million and to have nobody know it, to sit in the back row of an auction barn in patched overalls while men in suits laughed about your truck, to hear it, to say nothing, to simply wait. On Thursday morning, she drove to his farm. She had not called ahead. She wasn't entirely sure why she was going, only that after 2 days of reading his history in documents and numbers, she needed to see him face to face and ask the question that none of the records could answer. He was in the barn when she arrived, working on the 1973 4020, cleaning the fuel injectors with the focused attention of a man who has been doing this kind of work for so long that his hands know what to do while his mind goes somewhere else. He heard her car on the gravel and came to the barn door, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at her without surprise, without expectation. Just looked. Miss Pruitt, I'm sorry to come out without calling. I wanted to ask you something in person. He gestured toward the barn. She walked in. He leaned against the workbench and waited. She had prepared questions on the drive out. Organized, professional, sequential. They dissolved when she was actually standing in front of him in the barn with the cold November air coming through the gaps in the siding and the smell of grease and old metal around them. She asked the only question that mattered. Mr. Voss. Why? Harlan looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the photograph on the wall. She followed his gaze to the black and white image. Two men, a young one and an old one, standing in front of a Farmall H. That's Emmett Gale, he said. She waited. He was quiet for a while. When he spoke, it was in the measured, unhurried way of a man telling a story he has carried for a long time in silence and is only now finding the words for. He told her about coming back from Korea, about the $387, about Emmett hiring him and feeding him and watching him without judgment until the day he handed him the keys to the Farmall H and said, "Pay me when you can." He told her about farming those first 80 acres alone, about the first winter when the heater in the equipment shed broke, and he fixed it 3 times with parts he couldn't quite afford about the morning. In the spring of 1957, when he realized for the first time that he was going to make it. Not be comfortable, not be wealthy, just make it, and what that realization felt like after 4 years of not being certain. He told her about going to Emmett's kitchen in 1960 with cash to repay the value of the Farmall H, and about the 20 minutes they had sat across that table without speaking, and about Emmett finally accepting the money, not because he wanted it, but because he understood what it cost Harlan to carry it. He told her about the phone call in March of 1979. He told her about standing at the graveside in the cold, about driving home with $8,000 in an envelope and sitting with it on his kitchen table for 3 days, about Doyle Gale coming by and saying what his father had wanted, about putting the envelope in the drawer where it had stayed for 10 years. Sylvia was very still. Then he said, and his voice didn't change, didn't rise or fall or break, but something behind it shifted slightly, the way light shifts when a cloud moves. "I've been trying to figure out how to pay Emmett back ever since. Not with money. He didn't want money. He wanted me to do for someone else what he did for me. 32 times. 32, she said. One for each tractor, one for each young farmer on that list." Harlan looked at the photograph on the wall again. "I've been watching those men for years. Some of them I've known since they were boys. All of them need what I needed in 1954. Not money. A machine and a chance." The barn was quiet except for the wind moving through the trees outside. Sylvia thought about saying several things and said none of them. Finally, she said, "Mr. Voss, why did you buy that particular tractor on Saturday, the 32nd one? The oldest one. You could have waited and bought all 32 from the dealers directly." Harlan was quiet for a moment. "Emmett's Farmall H, the one he gave me. It wore out in '61. I sold it for scrap." He paused. That was a mistake. He looked at the 4020 on the barn floor at the machine he had cleaned and was restoring with slow, careful attention. Needed to have one like it again. Something to remind me what the whole thing started with. Sylvia drove back to Waterloo in the early afternoon with both hands on the wheel and her eyes on the empty highway and her mind turning the conversation over slowly, the way you turn something fragile. At the office, she made the calls to finalize the 23 tractor purchase. She coordinated payment, delivery, and logistics with Harlan's banker and the 6 dealers. She organized pickup schedules and transfer paperwork. She worked efficiently and without error because the work needed to be done correctly, and she was the person doing it. But underneath the mechanics of the work was the conversation in the barn sitting in her chest with a weight she didn't have a word for. On Friday morning, with the 23 tractor purchase finalized and payment delivered, Harlan came in to sign the final paperwork. He sat across from Sylvia's desk in the chair that clients used and signed, where she indicated steadily and without hurry. When he finished, he set the pen down and looked at her. 9 short of 32, she said. He nodded. "I'll source the other machines. There are dealers in Cedar Rapids and Iowa City who have comparable inventory. It'll take a week, maybe 2. And Prescott Dahl. Harlan looked at the window. The November sky outside was the same low pewter it had been all week, patient and absolute. Prescott Dahl has his reasons. She waited. There's history there. Not mine and his and Emmett's. He said it without bitterness, the way you state a fact about weather or soil. Some men carry things from a long time ago. I'm not here to sort that out. I just need 32 machines. He rose, thanked her, and was at the door when she said quietly without planning to Mr. Voss, "What you're doing? It's remarkable." Harlan stopped at the door. He stood with his back to her for a moment. "It's a debt, Miss Pruitt." He said it gently, without false modesty, without performance. "It's 35 years past due. That's all it is." He walked out into the gray Friday morning. Sylvia sat at her desk with the signed paperwork in front of her and the empty chair across from her, and the particular quality of silence that settles in a room after someone of genuine substance has left it. She had worked in agricultural commerce for 4 years. She had processed hundreds of transactions, had sat across from farmers who were wealthy, and farmers who were struggling, and farmers who were everything in between, had learned to read a financial statement the way other people read faces. She had never encountered anything like this. Not the money. The money was extraordinary, but money alone was not the thing. It was the patience of it, the length of it. The way a man could carry a debt for 35 years without letting it become bitterness, without letting it curdle into resentment or regret, holding it instead as something clean and forward-facing, a compass, rather than a weight. The way he had sat in the back row of that auction barn in patched overalls while men laughed about his truck and said nothing and waited because the moment wasn't right yet, and he had learned over 45 years of farming and saving and watching and listening that the right moment comes if you are patient enough to wait for it. She thought about Emmett Gale, dead 10 years now, buried somewhere in the Iowa soil he had farmed his whole life. And she thought about how a single act of belief in a 23-year-old ex-soldier with $387 had, through the slow accumulating logic of one man's patience and discipline and love, become 32 tractors and 32 chances for 32 young people who didn't know yet that someone had been watching them and believing in them from a distance for years. She thought about what Harlan had written at the top of his list: pay forward. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall, light and quiet, settling on the frozen fields without drama, the way serious things often arrive. Sylvia Pruitt looked at it for a long time. Then she picked up the phone and began making calls to dealers in Cedar Rapids. She hadn't been asked to. Harlan hadn't requested her help. But some debts, she was beginning to understand, don't announce themselves. They simply present themselves when the moment is right, and the only question is whether you are the kind of person who answers. She dialed the first number. The Farmer They Counted Out, Part 3, The Legacy of the Man. They underestimated Kim. The snow that had started falling on Friday afternoon did not stop until Sunday morning. It came down quietly and without apology, the way Iowa snow comes in November. Not the dramatic blizzard kind, but the patient settling kind, covering the frozen fields and the fence lines and the gravel roads with 2 inches of clean white that made the world look simpler than it was. By Sunday, the sky had cleared to a hard pale blue, and the sunlight came off the snow with a brightness that made you squint even before you were fully awake. Harlan spent the weekend sourcing machines. He made calls on Saturday evening and drove to Cedar Rapids on Sunday afternoon. A dealer named Virgil Tate had 4 tractors that fit the specifications. Another dealer outside Iowa City had 3 more. A retired farmer in Grundy Center had one he had kept in a shed for 7 years, maintained out of habit and affection, never quite able to sell it. Harlan drove to each one. He looked at each machine carefully, not the way a dealer looks at equipment, calculating resale value, but the way a farmer looks at a tool he is going to trust with serious work. He checked hours and hydraulics and engine compression. He looked at the wear patterns on the tires, in the condition of the PTO shaft, and the particular quality of the exhaust on a cold start. He bought all 8. By Tuesday of the following week, he had 32 tractors, 23 from the 6 dealers, 8 from private sources, and the 1973 4020 sitting in his own barn that he had bought on a Saturday afternoon while a room full of people laughed about his truck. 32 machines, 32 names on a piece of notebook paper. The arithmetic was simple. The weight of it was not. Sylvia had called ahead to 3 of the Cedar Rapids dealers on his behalf. He had not asked her to do this, and when he found out, he drove to her office and stood at her desk. "You didn't need to do that," he said. She looked up at him. "I know. I wanted to." He stood there for a moment. Then he said simply, "Thank you." 2 words. but the way he said them carried a third word underneath the one he didn't need to speak. They set a date for the distribution. Saturday, November 25th, 3 weeks after the auction, Harlan sent letters, not form letters, individual letters handwritten on plain white paper, one to each name on his list. He had spent evenings over the past decade making notes about each of these young men. Observations gathered quietly over years of county fairs and feed store conversations, and the particular kind of watching that farmers do when they want to understand someone without that someone knowing they are being studied. He knew their acreages and their situations. He knew who had been turned down by banks and who was farming with borrowed equipment and who was getting up before dawn every day because they believed in something that the economics of 1989 Iowa were not particularly disposed to reward. He knew Denny Fowler, 24 years old, whose father's operation had gone under in the 1985 crisis when the bank called the note on 300 acres, and Denny had watched everything his family built get auctioned off in a single afternoon. Denny was farming 80 rented acres now with a machine he had borrowed from a neighbor and was one mechanical failure away from losing a season. He knew Loretta Sims, 28 years old, who had been farming the 80 acres she and her husband Thomas had rented together until Thomas died of a heart attack in the spring of 1988 at 31 years old, leaving Loretta with the lease, the debt, 2 children under 5, and a 1969 tractor that burned oil and started hard on cold mornings. She had not quit. She had planted that spring alone and harvested alone and planted again the following spring methodically without drama because she had decided that quitting was not something she was willing to teach her children. He knew Calvin Pruitt, 19 years old, and no relation to Sylvia, the son of a coal miner from southern Iowa, who had moved the family to Waterloo when the mines started closing, who had fallen in love with farming during summers, spent at an uncle's place near Ames, and who had saved 4 years of after-school and weekend wages toward equipment he was still years from affording. 29 others with stories just as specific and just as real. Harlan wrote each letter by hand. He explained what he was offering: a tractor, no conditions beyond one. Help the next one when your time comes. He included directions to his farm and the date and time. He asked each recipient to come alone or with immediate family only. He did not describe himself or explain his circumstances. He signed each letter simply, Harlan Voss, Nashua, Iowa. He mailed them on a Wednesday. By Friday, he had received 3 phone calls, 2 of which he had to let go to the answering machine because he was in the barn. All 3 said essentially the same thing in different words and different levels of disbelief. Is this real? He called each one back and said, yes, it's real. Come Saturday. Saturday the 25th arrived, clear and cold, the sky the deep November blue that follows a hard frost. Harlan was up at 4:30 as he always was. He made coffee, ate 2 eggs and toast, washed the dishes, and walked out to the barn. He had arranged the tractors in the east field beside the barn, lined up in 2 rows of 16, their green paint catching the early light, their exhaust pipes pointing at the pale sky. He had spent the week servicing each machine personally, changed the oil, checked the filters, tested the hydraulics, adjusted the governor settings on the older engines. Each tractor ran clean and strong. He had wanted them right. By 8 in the morning, the first trucks were pulling into the gravel drive. They came one by one and then in clusters. Pickup trucks and old sedans, and in Loretta Sims's case, a borrowed station wagon with 2 child seats visible through the back window. They parked along the fence line and climbed out slowly, looking at the 2 rows of tractors in the field, with the expressions of people who had been told something extraordinary was true and were still in the process of believing it. Harlan stood at the barn door and watched them arrive. Doyle Gale was there too. He had come at Harlan's specific request, driving down from his farm north of Nashua in his own truck, arriving early and standing quietly to one side. He was 65 now. His father's broad shoulders and weathered face reproduced with only slight variation, and he stood in the cold with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched the young farmers arrive with an expression that was difficult to name. Harlan had not told Doyle the details in advance, only that he was doing something on Saturday that he wanted Doyle to see. When all 32 were present, Harlan walked to the center of the group. He was not a tall man, and he was not a loud man, and he did not use the occasion to be either. He spoke clearly and without preamble. My name is Harlan Voss. Most of you don't know me, and I'm not going to take up your morning explaining myself. What I'm going to tell you is simple. 35 years ago, a man named Emmett Gale gave me a machine and a chance when I had nothing. He said, "Pay me when you can." I paid him back in cash, and he sent the money home with me. He said the only debt he cared about was this one. He gestured at the field of tractors and then at the 32 young farmers standing in the cold watching him. "So here we are," he paused. "Each of you is getting a tractor today. No charge, no note, no interest. I have one condition only. Sometime in your life when you have the means and you see someone who needs what you needed today, you help them. That's it. That's the whole agreement." Nobody spoke. The cold air held the words the way cold air holds things that are true. Harlan said, "I have a list. When I call your name, come find your machine." He called them one by one. Denny Fowler came forward when his name was called, 24 years old, and trying to keep his face composed the way young men try to keep their faces composed when something they have needed for a long time is suddenly, unexpectedly given to them. He shook Harlan's hand. His grip was strong and his eyes were wet, and he said thank you in the quiet voice of a man who understands that thank you is not adequate, but that nothing else is either. Harlan said, "Your father farmed well. You will too." Denny stopped walking. He turned back. "How do you know about my father?" Harlan looked at him. "I've been watching you for 3 years, son. That's why you're here." Loretta Sims came forward with her two children, a girl of 4 and a boy of 3, both of them wide-eyed and silent, holding their mother's hands. Loretta was composed in the particular way of people who have learned composure as a survival tool rather than a social grace. People who have cried privately so many times that public emotion has become a luxury they've learned to defer. She shook Harlan's hand and looked at the tractor she had been assigned a 1984 444. Oh, that could handle twice the acreage she was currently farming, and said, "I can farm twice the ground with this." "That's the idea," Harlan said. She looked at him for a moment. Her children looked at him, then she said, "My husband would have wanted to shake your hand." Harlan held her gaze. "He was a good farmer, Thomas. I saw him work the Hendricks place in the summer of '87. He knew what he was doing." Loretta's composure cracked just slightly, just at the edges, the way ice cracks before it decides what to do next. Then she steadied and nodded and walked her children toward the 4-4-4-0. Calvin Pruitt, 19 years old and the youngest person in the field, came forward last because he had been standing in the back trying to make himself inconspicuous, which is what 19-year-olds do when they are overwhelmed and don't want it to show. He was a big kid, broad across the shoulders with his father's miner's build and his own particular directness of gaze. Harlan assigned him a 1982 4240 clean and strong, a machine that could anchor a serious beginning. Calvin looked at it and looked at Harlan and said, "I don't know how to thank you." Harlan said, "Come back in 10 years and tell me how it went." When all 32 had been assigned their machines, Harlan walked back to the barn. Doyle Gale fell in beside him without being asked. They walked together in silence for a moment, two old farmers in the cold November light, while behind them the field was full of young people touching machines they now owned, talking to each other and to their families, and to no one in particular. Some of them laughing, some quiet, and all of them standing differently than they had stood when they arrived. Doyle said quietly, "Dad would have liked this." Harlan walked a few more steps. "He would have argued with me about doing it all at once, said I was showing off." Doyle laughed a short, honest sound. "He would have been right." Harlan smiled. "He would have been right." They reached the barn. Harlan stopped at the door and looked back at the field, at the 2 rows of green machines and the 32 young farmers moving among them. "I've had that money in the drawer for 10 years, he said. "Not the 8,000, the whole thing. I've had everything I needed to do this for 10 years and I kept waiting." He was quiet for a moment, waiting for the right time, waiting until I was sure. He paused. "Emmett would have told me I waited too long." Doyle looked at him. Doyle looked at the field. He said he would have also told you that it happened at exactly the right time, because that's how he saw things. Harlan looked at the field for a long time. Then he said, "I found something this week in the barn. You should come see." They went inside. Harlan walked to the far end of the barn to the corner behind the workbench where the 1973 4020 sat clean and serviced. Beside it, in the shadow against the wall, was something that had not been there before. Something older. Something that had been in a neighbor's shed for 20 years and had been returned to him quietly by that neighbor's widow 3 days after the newspaper story ran. The Farmall H, Emmett Gale's Farmall H. Not the one Harlan had sold for scrap in 1961. A different one. The one Emmett had kept for himself after giving Harlan the first. Same model, same era, Same particular stance of a working machine that has done serious work without complaint for decades. Doyle stopped walking. He stared at the machine. His face did something complicated and private. Mom kept it, Harlan said quietly. After your father passed, Margaret Yellen took it when she cleared the equipment, said she couldn't sell it. I didn't know until she called me last week. Doyle walked to the machine slowly. He put one hand on the engine hood the way you put a hand on something you thought was gone. His jaw was set, and his eyes were the eyes of a man holding himself together by the specific effort of will that men of a certain generation and a certain upbringing applied to moments they were not prepared for. There was a package in the seat, Harlan said. Margaret found it wedged under the cushion when she moved it to her shed. She gave it to me when she returned the machine. On the farmall's worn seat was a small, flat package wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a piece of twine. Harlan picked it up and held it out to Doyle. Doyle took it. He stood with it in both hands. It's addressed to me, Harlan said, but I think you should be here when I open it. Doyle looked at the package. He nodded once. Harlan untied the twine with careful fingers. He unfolded the oilcloth. Inside was an envelope yellowed at the edges, sealed. On the front, in handwriting Harlan had not seen in 10 years, the careful, deliberate penmanship of a man who had learned to write in a one-room schoolhouse in 1920s Iowa. Harlan. Just the one word. Just his name. His hands went still. The barn was very quiet. Outside, the sounds of the young farmers came faintly through the walls, voices and engines starting up, and the particular sounds of people beginning something. But inside the barn, in the cold yellow light, there was only the two old men and the old machine and the letter. Harlan opened the envelope. The paper inside was folded twice. He unfolded it. The handwriting was Emmett's, but smaller than usual, more careful, as if the writer had understood that the words needed to last. He read it silently first. Then, because Doyle was standing beside him, and because some things should not be carried alone, he read it aloud. Harlan, I don't know when you'll find this, or if you ever will. I'm putting it here because this machine is yours in the way that matters, even if the paper says otherwise. And because I know that someday you'll either have it back or you'll have found another one just like it. You always were stubborn about the right things. I want you to know that I knew what I was doing in '54. I didn't give you that machine because I felt sorry for you. I gave it to you because I watched you work for 8 months and I saw something that I hadn't seen in a young man in a long time. I saw someone who understood that the land doesn't owe you anything and doesn't care how hard you want it and will only give back exactly what you earn from it with patience and time. That's not a common thing, Harlan. I don't want you to think it is. Whatever you've done with your life, by the time you read this, I believe it was right. I believe you paid attention to the things that matter. I believe you helped someone along the way because that's who you are underneath all that quiet. Don't pay me back. I'm serious about that. You know what I want instead. You've always known. That was always the deal between good men. Emmett, the barn was completely still. Harlan stood with the letter in his hands and did not try to manage what was happening in his face or his chest or the particular place behind the sternum where men of his generation store the things they do not say. He stood with it the way you stand with something true that has been waiting a long time to reach you. Doyle Gale stood beside him and said nothing because there was nothing to say, and because he understood, as his father had understood about Harlan 35 years ago, that some men need to be given space rather than words. After a while, Harlan folded the letter and put it in his shirt pocket against his chest. He looked at the Farmall H. He looked at the photograph on the wall. He looked at Doyle. He said, I want to give this machine to one of the young farmers outside, the one who needs it most. Doyle looked at him. That's a third tractor beyond the 32. Harlan said, I know. Which one? Harlan thought for a moment. Then he said, the young woman, Loretta Sims. She's farming alone with 2 children. She has the 4440 now, but this machine, he looked at the Farmall, this is a different kind of thing. This isn't a tool. This is a beginning. She needs to know what a beginning feels like. Doyle was quiet. Then he said Dad would have given it to her. Harlan said, I know he would have. He walked back out to the field. Loretta was near the 4440 showing her daughter how the steering wheel moved. The little girl had both hands on the wheel and was turning it with great seriousness. The boy was sitting on the rear tire watching. Loretta looked up when Harlan approached. He said, I have something else for you. It's in the barn. Will you come? She came. She stood in front of the Farmall H in the yellow barn light, and Harlan told her what it was, not the whole story, not the 35 years of it, but enough. That it had belonged to a man named Emmett Gale, who had understood what a beginning meant and had given one to a 23-year-old with nothing in 1954, and that this machine was the physical record of that belief and that he wanted her to have it. Loretta Sims put both hands on the Farmall's engine hood and closed her eyes for a moment. Her children stood on either side of her, one hand each holding her coat. She opened her eyes. She said, I'm going to farm for 50 years. I'm going to help people when I can. I'm going to tell my children about Emmett Gale and about you, and I'm going to take care of this machine until I don't have the strength to do it myself, and then I'm going to give it to someone who will. Harlan looked at her for a long time. He said, that's the whole deal right there. The story spread the way true stories spread in small communities, not all at once, but steadily, person to person, with a particular momentum of something that people recognize as real. The local paper ran it first the Friday after the distribution. Local farmer buys 32 tractors, gives them all away. The story explained the auction, the $3.3 million, the 32 young farmers, the one condition. It mentioned Emmett Gale. Doyle Gale read the story at his kitchen table on a Friday morning and sat with it for a long time. Agricultural journals picked it up. Farm Bureau newsletters ran it. By January of 1990, it had appeared in 3 regional newspapers. By spring, it was in the Farm Journal. Harlan did not seek the attention and did not particularly welcome it. He answered questions when asked briefly and without embellishment, and returned to his fields and his work in his particular form of invisible living. Then something else happened. On a Tuesday morning in late January, a truck Harlan didn't recognize pulled into his drive. He was in the barn working on a fence stretcher when he heard it. He came to the barn door. The man who got out was 61 years old, broad-shouldered, well-dressed, in the way of a man who has been prosperous for a long time. He walked toward the barn with the careful, deliberate step of someone who has rehearsed this visit and is no longer entirely sure it was a good idea. Harlan recognized him. Prescott Dahl. They stood looking at each other for a moment. The cold January air was absolutely still. In the distance, a crow called once and went quiet. Dahl said, I owe you an explanation. Harlan said, you don't owe me anything. Dahl looked at the ground, then at Harlan. He said, Emmett Gale and I had a disagreement in '62 over a land transaction. It wasn't clean on my side. He knew it. I knew it. He never said anything publicly. He just looked at me a certain way whenever we saw each other for the next 17 years. He paused. When I heard your name in November at the auction office, the Harlan Voss who worked for Emmett Gale, I reacted badly. Harlan waited. Dahl said, I read the story in the paper. I read it twice. He cleared his throat. Emmett Gale helped me in '62, after the disagreement. He could have ruined me. He had the means and the justification. Instead, he pulled me back from a mistake I was making, and he never spoke of it again. I repaid him by holding a grudge about it for 30 years because that's what guilty men do. The cold air held the words. Dahl looked at the field where the 2 rows of tractors had stood a month ago. He said, I've already been in touch with 8 young farmers through the county extension office. Sold them 8 tractors at my purchase price. No markup. He looked at Harlan. Not because you asked me to, because it was the right thing and I should have done it in November. Harlan studied Prescott Dahl's face for a moment. Not the face of the man in the Des Moines suit from the auction barn. Something older than that. Something that recognized the particular weight of a man who has finally set something down. He said, do you want some coffee? Dahl looked at him. Yes, I'd appreciate that. They went inside. They sat at Harlan's kitchen table, the same table where the envelope had lived in the drawer for 10 years, and drank coffee from plain white mugs and talked for an hour and a half. Not about money or tractors or newspaper stories. About farming, about Iowa in the '50s. About what it meant to work the same piece of ground for 40 years and what the ground gave back if you gave it the right things first. Prescott Dahl left at noon. At the door he turned and said, Emmett Gale was the most decent man I ever met. He said it plainly without performance. I should have said that 30 years ago. Harlan said he knew. Dahl nodded. He walked to his truck and drove away. Harlan stood at the door of his farmhouse and watched the truck until it disappeared over the ridge. Then he went back inside and washed the coffee mugs and put them in the drying rack and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the winter fields, the frozen ground, the bare trees along the fence line, the sky that had held the same cold blue for 3 weeks. He reached into his shirt pocket and touched the letter. That was always the deal between good men. He stayed at the window for a while. Then he went back to work. He farmed his 320 acres through the spring and summer of 1990 and the spring and summer of every year that followed. He drove the same truck. He wore the same overalls. He ate sandwiches at noon and drank coffee from a thermos and fixed things himself when they broke, which was often because things always broke, and the answer was always to fix them. He kept his list, added to it over the years, kept watching young farmers the way Emmett had watched him quietly, without their knowledge assessing not their balance sheets but their character, their patience, their willingness to be wrong and keep going, their relationship with the specific humility that farming demands and that most of modern life works hard to eliminate. In 1999, at 77 years old, he sold his 320 acres. He sold them to a 29-year-old farmer named Wallace Briggs, no relation, who had been farming, rented ground in Black Hawk County for 4 years, and who Harlan had been watching for 2. He sold at $80,000 per acre below current market value and financed the difference himself at 0 interest over 20 years. When Wallace asked him why, Harlan said, "Because Emmett Gale sold me a chance once for less than it was worth." He paused. "You remind me a little of myself at your age. Don't waste it." He moved into a small apartment in Waterloo. He lived on Social Security and investment income. He spent almost nothing and gave away almost everything that came back. Between 1990 and 2003, he gave away an additional $2.7 million. Young farmers' equipment, assistance, land financing, direct support in crisis years. 72 people in total direct recipients. He died on a Thursday morning in April of 2003. He was 81 years old. He died in his apartment in the bed he had bought secondhand, in the quiet way of a man who has done what he came to do and is not afraid of what comes next. His estate was valued at $9.4 million. Every dollar went to the Emmett Gale Young Farmer Foundation, not the Harlan Voss Foundation, not named for himself. Named for the man who had started it all with a Farmall H and 6 words and the particular irreplaceable gift of believing in someone when nobody else did. The funeral was held on a Saturday, which felt right. 912 people came. They filled the church and stood outside in the April cold. They came from 6 counties and 3 states, and they stood in the kind of silence that 900 people stand in when they understand they are gathered around something larger than an individual life. Sylvia Pruitt, 39 years old, stood at the front of the church and spoke. She said, "I met Harlan Voss on a Saturday in November of 1989 when he walked into my office with a piece of notebook paper and a request that made no sense to me until it made all the sense in the world." She paused. He had $11 million and drove a truck held together by rust. He had 32 tractors and gave them all away. He had a debt he carried for 35 years, and he paid it in the only way it could be paid, by multiplying it, by turning one act of belief into 32, and then 72, and then 200 more, through the foundation that carries the name of the man he never stopped owing. She looked out at the 900 people. She said, "The richest poor man in Iowa. That's what his headstone says." She paused. "But I think Emmett Gale would have said something different. I think he would have said, 'That's my man Harlan.' Paid it forward, just like we agreed." Doyle Gale sat in the front row with his hands folded and his eyes closed in his father's face. Outside in the April sunlight, the Iowa fields were beginning to green. The frost was leaving the ground inch by inch, as it always did and always would. The soil was waking up, doing what soil does when the season turns, beginning again, with the patient, unhurried certainty of something that has always known what it is for. In 28 of those fields, tractors that had once stood in a line on a November morning were doing their work. Green machines moving through black earth. The children of the farmers who received them were sometimes in those cabs, now learning the language of the land, the way their parents had learned it, the way Harlan had learned it, the way Emmett before him had learned it and passed it on. A debt paid in the only currency that never loses value. On a headstone in the Nashua Municipal Cemetery, cut simply into gray Iowa granite, Harlan D. Voss, 1922 to 2003. Farmer, giver, the richest poor man in Iowa. And below that smaller added at Doyle Gale's quiet request he paid it forward. That was always the deal. The fields went on, the seasons turned, the debt kept multiplying in the only direction it was ever meant to go. Forward, always forward.